The moment Opal Ford rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, in the blazing summer of 1882, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she rode like someone who had already buried the worst thing that could happen to her and was still moving forward anyway. She sat tall in the saddle of a roan mare that was tired and dusty, but still proud, matching her rider in that way horses sometimes do when they've traveled far with a person who has no intention of stopping. Opal's dark hair was pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Her riding coat was the color of dried sage, and her jaw was set so firmly that the men watching instinctively stepped back half a pace. She had green eyes the color of Summer Creek water, and right now those eyes were scanning the storefronts like she was reading a list she intended to check off one item at a time. She was 24 years old, and she had ridden nearly 300 miles alone with a dead man's deed folded against her chest, and a grudge so old and so righteous it had become part of her spine. The town of Dusty Creek was a proper settlement by 1882 standards, with a main road packed hard by wagon wheels, a general store, a land office, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a livery stable, and a modest courthouse that doubled as the sheriff's office. There was also a small church at the far end, its white paint peeling in the relentless New Mexico sun, and a hotel called the Brentwood that had 4 rooms and a dining area that smelled permanently of beef stew and coffee. Opal pulled her mare up in front of the land office and dismounted in one clean motion, looping the reins over the hitching post with the efficiency of a woman who did not waste movement. She reached into the front of her coat and withdrew a folded document, its edges worn soft from being handled and rehandled over many miles and many long nights. She looked at it once, pressed it flat against her palm, and pushed through the door of the land office. The man behind the counter was named Gerald Prout, a reedy fellow with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He looked up from his ledger with the mild expression of someone who expected her to ask about a mail-order shipment or a message for a husband somewhere. "I need to see whoever handles land disputes," Opal said. Gerald blinked. "That would be the county assessor, but he's only in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's Wednesday." "Then who's next in line?" "Well, for a formal dispute you'd need—" "I'm not looking for formal," Opal said. "I am looking for someone with enough authority to read a deed and tell me if it's valid." Gerald pushed his spectacles up his nose. "That would be Oliver Hayes, ma'am. He's the biggest landowner in the county, and he sits on the land committee. He'd know what a valid deed looks like better than most." "Where do I find him?" "His ranch is about 4 miles north of town, the Hayes Quarter Circle, but you might catch him here in town today. He comes in most Wednesdays for supplies and a meeting at the sheriff's office. Tall fellow, brown hair, usually wearing a gray vest." Opal thanked him with a single nod and walked back out into the sun. She scanned the street again with those measuring green eyes and spotted the gray vest almost immediately, 2 storefronts down, where a man was loading burlap sacks onto a flatbed wagon with the practiced ease of someone who was strong enough that the work cost him very little effort. Oliver Hayes was 28 years old, lean but broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been made handsome by weather and work rather than accident of birth. His brown hair curled slightly at the temples under his hat, and there was a seriousness to him that sat alongside a quality that was harder to name, something like steadiness, like a fence post that had been driven deep into good ground. He had dark eyes, nearly black, and when he looked up from his work and saw her walking toward him, those eyes registered something more than just a stranger approaching. "Are you Oliver Hayes?" Opal asked. "I am," he said, straightening up and settling the last sack onto the wagon. He pulled off his work glove and extended his hand. "And you are—" "Opal Ford. I need you to read something." She held out the deed. He looked at her hand, then at her face, then he took the document with the careful attention of a man who understood that paper in this territory carried enormous weight. He unfolded it slowly, read the first line, and then his expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but not quite. He read the whole thing in silence. It took a full minute. Then he looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and his voice was quiet in the way that meant he was being careful. "My father gave it to me before he died," Opal said. "He was Thomas Ford. He had a claim on the Clearwater parcel north of the creek bend before anyone else out here was using it. That deed was filed in Santa Fe in 1871. He worked that land for 6 years before a man named Caldwell pushed him off it." Oliver Hayes looked back down at the deed. His thumb traced the official seal at the bottom of the page. Then he looked up again, and something in his expression had become more serious, more deliberate. "Miss Ford," he said, "I think you need to sit down. Come inside somewhere, because this deed is real and this land is yours." There was a moment of pure, suspended quiet between them, the kind that happens when something important has just been said out loud for the first time, and the world has to catch up to the sound of it. Opal Ford had ridden 300 miles holding a grudge and a piece of paper, telling herself the paper was real, telling herself her father had not been cheated out of his life's work for nothing, telling herself she was not wrong to have made this journey. And now a stranger with dark eyes was standing in the New Mexico sun telling her she was right. The backs of her eyes burned in a way she absolutely refused to let become tears. "Show me what you mean," she said. They went inside the land office, where Gerald Prout made himself very busy with his ledger in the far corner, and Oliver spread the deed out on the wide counter and pointed to specific lines, the date of original filing, the survey coordinates as they had been recorded, the official stamp of the New Mexico Territory Land Registry. "The Clearwater parcel," Oliver said, tracing the boundary lines with his fingertip. "This is roughly 1,200 acres along the North Creek. I know this land. It runs up against the eastern edge of my own property." He paused. "Caldwell's been claiming it for years. He fenced it about 4 years ago and started running cattle on it. Everyone around here assumes it's his." "It is not his," Opal said flatly. "My father filed this deed before Caldwell was anywhere near New Mexico. Caldwell came through in 1877 and just decided the land was empty enough to take. When my father tried to argue it, Caldwell had money and men and my father had neither." Oliver was quiet for a moment, studying the deed again. "Caldwell has money and men now too," he said carefully. "This isn't going to be an easy thing to claim." "I did not ride 300 miles because I thought it would be easy," Opal said. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he seemed to be seeing not just the deed and the situation but her, the person standing there. He saw the dust of a long road on her coat, and the tiredness behind the steadiness in her eyes, and the way her hand had clenched slightly at her side when she mentioned Caldwell's name, not in fear but in the specific controlled fury of someone who had been waiting a long time for the moment they were standing in. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "I was going to see what the hotel had." "Let me pay for 2 nights," he said, and when she started to object he held up a hand. "Not charity. I want time to properly look at this deed and the county records. If this is as solid as it looks, you have a real legal claim. But you'll need time and a plan, and you should not be sleeping in a barn while we sort it out." Opal studied him with those clear green eyes, measuring him the way she'd been measuring people since she was old enough to understand that some people were worth trusting and some absolutely were not. "I'll pay for my own room," she said, "but I'll accept the conversation." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something close to it, the beginning of one. "Fair enough," Oliver said. She settled her mare at the livery stable, paying old Pete Gruber out of the small but carefully preserved sum of money she had brought from home, making sure the mare was watered and fed before she saw to herself. Then she took a room at the Brentwood Hotel, washed the road off her face and hands, and came back downstairs to find Oliver Hayes already seated at one of the dining tables with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. She sat down across from him, and they spent the next 2 hours going through everything she knew. She told him about her father, Thomas Ford, who had come west from Missouri in 1869, with a young wife and a 2-year-old daughter, and the kind of idealism that the Western territories ground down and sometimes completely destroyed. He had found the Clearwater parcel and loved it, had spent years improving it, had built a small cabin on the north end near the spring, had dug irrigation channels by hand, had planted apple trees along the eastern fence line. Then Harlan Caldwell had come through in 1877, a man with money from somewhere back east, and the particular kind of confidence that came from having always been able to buy his way through obstacles. He had looked at the Clearwater parcel and decided he wanted it, and he had found that the easiest way to take it was not through the legal system, but through a series of pressures and threats that the local authorities were either too weak or too paid off to address. He had run Thomas Ford's cattle off the land, had torn down the fencing, had confronted Thomas at his own door with 3 armed men, and had made it very clear that continuing to claim the land would have physical consequences. Thomas Ford had been 41 years old at that point, with a wife who was already sick and a daughter who was 14, and he had made the calculation that his family's safety was worth more than the fight. He had retreated to a rented property in Las Cruces, had worked as a laborer for years, had watched his wife's health decline and eventually fail, had grown old and thin and sad. But he had kept the deed. He had kept it because he could not let go of the idea that someday the injustice could be corrected, that the paper in the land registry in Santa Fe meant something, that what was his was his. He had died 3 months ago at the age of 54, which was not an old age but felt like one when you had lived those years carrying that kind of weight. And before he died, he had pressed the deed into Opal's hands and told her she was the only one he trusted to do something with it. Oliver listened to all of this without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in front of him, his dark eyes steady and attentive. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell is still there," he said. "He's built up considerably. He's got about 40 cowhands working that range now, including the Clearwater parcel. He's also got something of a relationship with the current county commissioner, which makes the local authorities," he paused, choosing his words, "less reliable than they might otherwise be." "Then what do we do?" Opal asked. "The deed is filed in Santa Fe," Oliver said. "That's territorial level, which means it supersedes county politics. The county commissioner is not actually the relevant authority here. We need the territorial land office." He leaned forward slightly. "I ride to Santa Fe 2 or 3 times a year. I have contacts there. The Territorial Land Registry keeps original records, and if your father's filing is in there, and I believe it is, because this deed is exactly what an authentic 1871 filing looks like, then you have a legal case that even Harlan Caldwell's money can't simply buy away." "How long would that take?" Opal asked. "A few weeks if we're lucky. Maybe 2 months if Caldwell decides to fight it hard in the territorial courts." Opal nodded slowly. "I have some money. Not a lot." "I'm not asking for money," Oliver said, and he said it with such simple directness that it caught her off guard. "Your father was cheated out of land that was his. That's wrong. And the fact that the territory let it happen is a failure of what we're supposed to be building out here." He paused again. "I'd like to help you." Opal looked at him for a long, careful moment. "Why?" she asked. Not challenging, just honest. Oliver met her gaze without flinching. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because I've lived next to Harlan Caldwell's property for 4 years now, and I know exactly what kind of man he is." He picked up his coffee cup, seemed to remember it was cold, set it down. "And possibly because you rode 300 miles alone with a dead man's deed and didn't ask for anybody's permission to show up and claim what's yours. That's not nothing." The candor of it surprised a small laugh out of Opal, the first real one she'd had in months. It was a brief thing, over almost before it started, but it was real, and Oliver caught it with what was now unmistakably a smile. "I'll need to copy the deed and send the copy to a contact at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe," Oliver said. "Gerald Prout can make a clean copy. He does it for official documents all the time. We send the copy with a letter from me and we wait to hear back." In the meantime, you should not approach Caldwell's property or announce yourself in town as Thomas Ford's daughter." "I am not in the habit of hiding," Opal said. "I know," Oliver said. "But there is a difference between hiding and being strategic. One is cowardice, the other is good sense." She considered this. "All right," she said, "I'll be strategic." Over the next several days, a pattern established itself between them so naturally that neither of them thought to question it. Oliver came into town each morning on the pretext of business, and he and Opal met for breakfast at the Brentwood, where they talked, going over documents, discussing strategy, but also beginning, slowly and then with increasing ease, to talk about other things. She learned that he had built the Quarter Circle Ranch largely himself, starting 7 years ago with a modest inheritance and an enormous amount of work. He had 2 full-time ranch hands, brothers named Cal and Domingo Reyes, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Alvarez who had been with him for 5 years, and ran his household with an iron practicality that he clearly respected enormously. He had grown up in Texas, had come to New Mexico territory looking for land of his own after his family's farm was swallowed by debt, and he had made something real and solid here. "Do you have family?" Opal asked one morning over coffee. "A sister back in Texas," Oliver said. "Married well, 3 children. She writes regularly and worries about me living out here alone." He glanced at his cup. "She's been trying to introduce me to every unmarried woman in her county for the past 2 years. Does that bother you?" He looked up. "The introductions or the concern?" "Either." He thought about it honestly. "The concern doesn't bother me. She means well. The introductions," he paused. "They bother me a little, not because I object to the idea of marriage, but because the women she introduces me to are chosen for their family names or their father's property. They're looking at me the same way." He looked out the window at the bright street. "I'd rather sit down with a woman who has something real to say." Opal was quiet for a moment after that, and then she changed the subject because she was not yet ready for what was quietly beginning to happen between them. She learned about him in pieces, the way you do when someone is worth knowing. She learned that he read every book he could get his hands on, ordering them by catalog from back east and reading by lamplight in the evenings after the ranch work was done. She learned that he was an exceptionally fair employer, that Cal and Domingo Reyes were paid honestly and treated with the kind of basic respect that was not universal in that time and place, and that Mrs. Alvarez had her own room and her own small garden, and was consulted on household decisions like a partner rather than just a servant. She learned that he had strong opinions about water rights and cattle breeding and the management of grazing land, and that he expressed these opinions directly without bullying, simply as what he knew and thought, open to disagreement. And he learned about her. That she had worked as a seamstress and alterations specialist in Las Cruces after her mother died, that she had a gift for precision and patience that translated well to the work, that she had been saving money for 2 years specifically for this journey, that she had a sharp sense of humor that appeared unexpectedly and then disappeared just as fast, like sunlight through a cloud break, that she missed her father with a grief that was still new enough to surprise her sometimes, catching her off guard in the middle of something ordinary, a tide that came in without warning. He also learned that she had a quality he could only describe as moral clarity. She did not talk about what she wanted in ambiguous terms. She knew what was right and what was wrong, and she did not dress it up in polite language when direct language would do. He found this extraordinary. On the 4th day, a complication arrived. Opal was coming out of the general store with a small bag of supplies when she nearly walked directly into a man who was coming up the steps. He was a big man, late 40s, with a florid face and the particular swagger of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room. He was dressed expensively for the territory, good leather boots and a coat that was too fine for a working rancher. Harlan Caldwell. She recognized him immediately. She had been 14 the last time she'd seen him, but some faces you do not forget. especially when they are attached to the worst thing that ever happened to your family. He was older now, heavier, with gray at his temples, but the eyes were the same, cold and calculating and utterly certain of their own entitlement. He did not recognize her. Why would he? The last time he had seen her, she had been a child standing at her father's side on the porch of a house he had been in the process of taking away from them. "Pardon me, ma'am," Caldwell said, with the automatic courtesy of a man who had learned that good manners cost nothing and sometimes bought you quite a lot. "Of course," Opal said, keeping her voice perfectly neutral, stepping aside to let him pass. She watched him go into the general store and then stood very still on the step for 3 full seconds, breathing. Then she walked on down the street, calm on the outside and burning on the inside. She told Oliver about it that evening when he came into town to meet her. They sat at the table in the Brentwood and she described the encounter with the flat precision of someone reporting a fact. Oliver listened carefully. "He doesn't know who you are," he said. "Not yet," Opal said. "But in a town this size, it will not stay that way forever." "The copy of the deed has already gone to Santa Fe," Oliver said. "I sent it 2 days ago with a writer I trust. My contact at the territorial office is a man named Edmund Baxter, and he is the kind of man who reads documents the same day they arrive. I expect to hear back within 10 days. What happens when Caldwell finds out what I'm doing?" Oliver looked at her steadily. "He'll resist it. He may try to pressure you to drop the claim. He may try to work through the county commissioner to complicate things locally." He paused. "But here is the thing about Caldwell. He relies on people being afraid of him or not knowing their rights. You are neither afraid nor ignorant. And a territorial land filing from 1871 is not something he can make disappear with local political pressure." "He could make other kinds of pressure," Opal said. "He could try," Oliver said. "He won't find it as effective as he expects." There was something in the way he said it, quietly but with complete certainty, that made Opal understand he was not simply expressing an opinion. He was making a statement of intent. He intended to stand between Caldwell's pressure and her, and he was stating this as plainly as he stated everything else, directly, without drama, as a simple fact of what was going to happen. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man she had known for 4 days, and felt something shift in her chest that she had not been expecting and was not entirely sure she was ready for. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough," Oliver said. He held her gaze for a moment, then added, "I know you're right. That's enough to start." She said nothing, but she did not look away either. 2 days later, Oliver came into town with news from the ranch that moved the timeline considerably forward. One of Caldwell's hands, a man named Porter who had recently quit Caldwell's employ after some kind of dispute about wages, had come to the quarter circle looking for work. Cal Ray's had turned him down for work but had been polite about it, and over a cup of coffee Porter had mentioned, apparently just making conversation, that Caldwell had recently been visited by someone from the county commissioner's office, and that the meeting had gone on for several hours with raised voices at various points. "Caldwell already knows something is happening," Oliver said. "He may not know what, but he senses movement." "How is that possible? Nothing has happened officially yet." "Small towns talk," Oliver said. "Gerald Pruitt is not the most discreet man in New Mexico. I should have thought of that." He did not say it with anger, just acknowledgement of a misjudgment. "You need to move faster than I planned." He had been sitting across from her in the small hotel parlor, but now he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street with the focused look of a man working through options. Opal watched him. She had begun to notice the details of him in a way that meant more than just observation. The way he stood, upright but relaxed, occupying space without encroaching on it. The way his hands moved when he was thinking, one thumb running along the edge of his opposite palm. The way he always thanked people for small services, Pete Gruber at the livery, the woman who brought coffee at the hotel, as if courtesy was simply the natural state and not something performed. "I want to take you out to the Clearwater parcel," he said, turning back from the window. "I want you to see it, not from a distance but actually walk the land. I think it matters for what comes next, and I think," he paused, choosing words again, "I think you should see what your father was protecting." The suggestion caught her somewhere unguarded. She had been so focused on the legal fight, on the deed as a document, on Caldwell as an adversary, that she had not let herself think about the land as a place. Her father's place. The place he had loved enough to carry grief about for the last decade of his life. "All right," she said softly. They rode out the next morning at first light, Oliver on his big gray gelding and Opal on her roan mare, following the road north out of town and then cutting east across open range. The morning was magnificent in the way New Mexico mornings sometimes are, the sky a shade of blue that seemed almost implausible, the light coming across the land sideways and turning everything golden, the sage and the dry grass and the pale rock formations all lit from the side, so that they seemed to have depth and dimension beyond the ordinary. After about an hour of riding, they came to the North Creek, a genuine creek rather than just a seasonal wash, with cottonwood trees along both banks and the sound of running water that seemed extravagant in that dry country. Oliver reined in his gelding and Opal pulled up beside him. "This is the eastern boundary of the Clearwater parcel," he said. "Your father's land begins here." Opal looked at the creek, at the cottonwood trees with their leaves flashing silver green in the morning breeze, at the meadow beyond the bank where the grass grew lush near the water's edge. Something moved through her that she couldn't immediately name. It was something between recognition and loss, as if her body remembered a place she had never been to, carried in her through years in her father's voice when he talked about the spring and the trees and the good grass. She dismounted without speaking and walked down to the bank of the creek. She crouched at the water's edge and put her fingers in it, cold and clear, running over polished stones. Stayed there for a moment, just listening to the water. Oliver stayed on his horse, giving her the moment, which was exactly the right thing to do. She stood up and looked north along the line of the creek. "He used to describe this," she said, "the spring that fed the creek. He said it never went dry even in the worst summers. He said it was the reason he chose this parcel above anything else." "The spring is still there," Oliver said. "About a quarter mile up." He paused. "Do you want to see it?" They rode along the creek bank to the spring, which rose from the ground in a small rocky basin, surrounded by what had been Opal's father's apple trees. They were still alive, tended by nobody in particular but surviving because apple trees are tough, now big and spreading and tangled, their old trunks gray and rough. They would not have fruit this year, maybe not next, but they were alive, and the sight of them hit Opal like a physical thing. Thomas Ford had planted those trees. His hands had put them in the ground. They were still here. She pressed her palm flat against the bark of the nearest one and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. And Oliver Hayes watched her from a respectful distance and felt something happen in his chest that was quietly and entirely reshaping him. "He always said the apple trees were proof," she said without opening her eyes, "that you can put something into the ground and it lasts beyond you. He said it was the best argument against giving up." She opened her eyes and looked at the tree. "I thought he was being philosophical. He was talking about these trees." Oliver said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "We're going to get this back for you." She turned and looked at him, and for the first time since she had ridden into Dusty Creek she allowed herself to believe it completely. Not just the legal possibility but the actual reality of it. The land, the creek, the spring, the apple trees, hers, her father's gift to her made real. "Thank you," she said, and it was the most simply honest thing she had said to him, containing more than the words. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have to deal with Caldwell." On the ride back to town, they talked differently than they had before, more easily, more openly, the way people do after they have shared something real. Oliver told her about what it had been like to build his ranch from nothing. The first winter when the cattle losses had nearly broken him. The second year when the grass had been so good it had felt like a reprieve from a death sentence. He described the landscape around his property with a genuine love for it that she recognized because it was exactly the kind of love her father had had for the Clearwater parcel. "Do you ever think about going back to Texas?" she asked. "No," he said simply and without nostalgia. "This is my ground now." She looked at him, riding alongside her in the morning light, easy in the saddle, unhurried. "You said your ranch is on the eastern edge of the Clearwater parcel," she said. "Doesn't that make us neighbors, once all this is sorted out?" The corner of his mouth moved again in that way it did. "It does," he said. "I had noticed that." The reply and the way he said it, the brief contained warmth of it, settled something in her chest that she was beginning to stop fighting. The letter from Edmund Baxter at the Territorial Land Office arrived 9 days after Oliver had sent the deed copy, which was faster than either of them had expected, and which Oliver said was a sign that Baxter considered it a priority. The letter was addressed to Oliver at the quarter circle, and he brought it into town the same afternoon it arrived, coming through the door of the Brentwood with a briskness that told her it was good news before he even spoke. She was in the small parlor with her sewing, which she had started doing in the evenings to occupy her hands and her mind, working on a small alterations project for one of the town women who had heard she had the skill. Oliver sat down across from her and opened the letter. Baxter's letter was precise and official in tone, but the content was unambiguous. Thomas Ford's original filing from 1871 was in the Territorial Registry exactly as the deed described it. The filing was legitimate, complete, and had never been formally superseded, contested through legal process, or voluntarily transferred. Harlan Caldwell's subsequent claims to the land, which apparently existed in the county records as a county-level assertion rather than a proper territorial filing, were legally inferior to the original territorial deed. Baxter was prepared to certify this in writing to any court in the territory, and he strongly recommended that Opal Ford apply for a formal territorial writ of ownership, which would carry the full weight of the territorial government and could not be overridden by county officials. At the bottom of the letter, in slightly warmer language than the official opening, Baxter had written that he was sorry for Thomas Ford's death and that it was gratifying to be able to confirm that his claim had been valid throughout. Opal read the letter twice. The first time her hands shook slightly, the second time they were steady. "He was right," she said quietly. "All those years he was right." "He was right," Oliver confirmed. "And now we can prove it." There were still steps to take. Oliver sent a letter back to Baxter, requesting the formal territorial writ, which would take another 2 weeks to be processed and returned. In the meantime, the business with Caldwell had to be managed carefully, because a man who was about to lose 1,200 acres of land he had been using for years was not going to accept the news quietly. Caldwell found out who Opal was on the 11th day of her stay in Dusty Creek. She was at the general store again when she heard her name spoken loudly enough that the whole store could hear it, and she turned to find Caldwell himself standing in the doorway with 2 of his hands behind him, looking at her with the expression of a man who has just identified a problem. "Opal Ford," he said. "Thomas Ford's girl." "His daughter, yes," Opal said, turning fully to face him. The store went very quiet. Old Silas behind the counter seemed to develop a sudden urgent interest in the floor. "I heard you've been stirring up some business about the Clearwater land," Caldwell said. His tone was the surface-friendly tone of someone who wanted to seem reasonable while making a threat. "I am pursuing the legal ownership of land that was filed in my father's name in 1871 and has never been legally transferred," Opal said, in the same even tone she would have used to state a fact about the weather. Caldwell stepped further into the store, his hands moving behind him. He looked at her with the calculating patience of someone who had done this before. "Your father gave up that claim years ago." "He did not give up any legal claim," Opal said. "He was driven off the land by pressure and threat. That is not the same thing as a legal transfer. You know that." "I have county records. You have county records that were created after the fact by a county official whose relationship with you I think would bear some examination, Opal said. You do not have a territorial filing. My father's filing from 1871 is in the Santa Fe registry and is valid. Caldwell's surface friendliness had entirely evaporated. He looked at her now with the naked look of a man who was used to getting his way through any means available and was assessing which ones applied here. Young woman, he said, you do not understand what you are getting into. I understand it completely, Opal said, and I want you to understand something as well. I am not my father at 41 with a sick wife and a child to protect. I am 24 years old, I have nothing to lose, I have a valid territorial deed. I have the confirmation of the territorial land registrar in Santa Fe, and I have no intention of being pressured into anything. The land is mine. I am going to claim it. She said it all without raising her voice. The quiet of it was more effective than shouting would have been. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned and walked out of the store without another word. The two hands followed him. Old Silas at the counter released a breath that he had apparently been holding since Caldwell walked in. Lord Almighty, Silas said softly. Opal went back to examining the fabric samples she had been looking at before the interruption. Her hands were perfectly steady. When she told Oliver about the confrontation that afternoon, she described it matter-of-factly, including Caldwell's final silent look before he left. Oliver listened carefully. You shouldn't be alone in town until this is resolved, he said. I can manage. I know you can manage, he said, and the precision of it stopped her objection because it was not the objection she'd expected. He was not saying she couldn't handle herself. What I mean is that Caldwell may not approach you directly again. He'll work indirectly, through the county commissioner or through men he employs. Being alone makes you a more convenient target for that kind of indirect pressure. Having people around makes it harder. She considered this. You're suggesting I stay at the quarter circle. He met her eyes. I have a proper guest room and Mrs. Alvarez is there. It would be entirely appropriate, and you'd be 4 miles from town, which puts some distance between you and Caldwell's reach in Dusty Creek. The logic was sound. She knew the logic was sound. She also knew that agreeing to stay at his ranch was a step across some line, even if the line was only in her own awareness of what was happening between them. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it that night, lying in her narrow hotel bed listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. The occasional horse on the street, someone laughing in the Silver Spur saloon 2 blocks away, the dry wind moving through the gaps in the window frame. She thought about her father who had trusted her with this. She thought about the apple trees, still alive, still rooted in their ground. She thought about Oliver Hayes, who had read a dead man's deed and said, "Sit down, this is yours," and had meant every word of it. In the morning she told him she would move to the quarter circle. The quarter circle ranch was exactly as she had imagined it, built with real care. A solid main house with a wide porch, a bunkhouse for the hands, a good barn, a kitchen garden behind the house that was clearly Mrs. Alvarez's domain. The house itself was full of books, shelved on every available wall space, and the front parlor had 2 reading chairs positioned near the window in a way that suggested regular use. Mrs. Alvarez was a small, broad woman of about 50 with silver-streaked dark hair and an efficient manner that softened immediately when she looked at Opal's dusty coat and travel-worn hands. "You have ridden a long way," she said, not as a question. "I have," Opal said. "Come in," Mrs. Alvarez said, in the tone of someone who had decided a thing. "There is soup on the stove." Cal and Domingo Reyes were just what Oliver had described. Honest, hard-working men in their late 20s, who treated Oliver with a respect that was clearly based on being treated fairly in return, and who greeted Opal with the straightforward courtesy of men who had decided she was all right because Oliver had decided she was all right. The first evening at the quarter circle, after supper, Oliver showed her the ranch ledgers, not because she had asked, but because he seemed to want her to understand the full picture of what was happening financially. The ranch was profitable but not lavish. He ran about 300 cattle on his portion of the range, sold beef to the army fort 2 days south and to several towns. He had plans to expand slowly, carefully, without overreaching. The plans were written out in a small leather notebook in his precise handwriting, each step numbered and costed, realistic to the point of being almost conservative. "You plan carefully," she observed. "I've seen what happens when people don't," he said. "My father borrowed against the future and the future didn't cooperate." He looked at the ledger for a moment. "I'd rather build slowly and keep what I build." She turned a page of the notebook. "These apple trees you've sketched in on the east boundary," he looked up quickly. The sketch she was looking at was small, almost incidental in a margin. 6 or 7 trees drawn with the kind of attention that meant something to the person drawing. "I thought about planting some," he said, and something in his voice was slightly different, slightly careful. "Along the fence line on the east side near the creek. I've always liked apple trees." Opal looked at the small drawing for a moment. "My father said the ones on the Clearwater Spring." "I know," Oliver said quietly. "I can see them from my eastern pasture when I ride that edge of my property." "I've always thought they were," he paused. "I didn't know whose they were until you told me, but I always thought they were worth taking care of." Something in that simple sentence, the idea that he had noticed her father's trees without knowing they were her father's trees, caring about them simply because they were worth caring about, undid something in Opal that had been tied tight for a very long time. She did not cry. She was not someone who cried easily. But her throat tightened and she looked down at the notebook page for a moment to let it pass. "Thank you," she said when she trusted her voice, "for noticing them." "They're good trees," he said simply, and he did not make the moment larger than it was, just let it settle, which was exactly right. The days at the quarter circle had a rhythm that Opal fell into with a surprising naturalness. She rose early, helped Mrs. Alvarez with the kitchen garden and the morning tasks, occasionally worked on the sewing projects she had taken from town women who had heard of her skill, and followed her business out to the ranch with a practical informality that was endearing. Oliver spent his mornings on ranch work, and his afternoons on correspondence related to her land claim, writing letters, following up with Edmund Baxter in Santa Fe, consulting with a lawyer in Albuquerque named Mr. Santos who had agreed to handle the formal writ filing. In the evenings they sat on the porch or in the parlor and talked. Sometimes they read in companionable silence, Oliver working through a thick novel and Opal with a book she'd borrowed from his shelf. Some evenings swapping opinions about what they were reading in exchanges that started informally and sometimes lasted until the lamp oil was running low. She began to see, in these evenings, the full landscape of who he was. He was a man who had thought carefully about justice and fairness in the specific and concrete way of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand, rather than in the abstract. He had opinions about the treatment of the Apache and Navajo peoples that were, for a white rancher in New Mexico Territory in 1882, remarkably honest. He recognized that the land beneath them all had come at a cost that was not his to pretend did not exist. "My grandfather in Texas," he said one evening, when they were talking about the territory's recent history, "used to talk about the land as if it had simply been there empty, waiting for someone to improve it. He didn't talk about the people who had been moved off it. He looked out the dark window. I grew up believing him. It took me years to understand that what he was describing as empty was only empty because of what had been done to make it that way." He was quiet for a moment. "Understanding that didn't mean I could undo it, but it changed how I thought about what owning land means, what it's worth and what it costs." Opal looked at him in the lamplight. "You think about things more carefully than most men I've known," she said. "I've made enough mistakes to make me careful," he said. "What kind of mistakes?" he considered. "When I was younger I was quicker to act and slower to think. I got into a situation in Texas before I came out here." He paused, A business arrangement with a man who turned out to be dishonest, who was cheating people, and I was involved long enough that I had to make a choice about what I was going to do about it. I made the right choice in the end, but not quickly enough. By the time I did what needed doing, people had already been hurt. He looked at her. I learned that clarity is better reached faster. That if you know something is wrong, there's no benefit to waiting to acknowledge it. Is that why you read my father's deed and said what you said immediately? Opal asked. He looked at her steadily. Partly, he said. And partly because it was obvious. She looked at him for a moment in the warm light. Nothing about this situation is obvious to most people, she said gently. It was obvious to me, he said, and the directness of it, the simplicity of how he said it, made something bloom in her chest like the first warm day after a hard winter. The formal writ of ownership arrived from Santa Fe 3 weeks after Opal had moved to the quarter circle. It came in a heavy envelope with the seal of the New Mexico Territory on it, carried by a territorial messenger, who handed it to Oliver with the seriousness appropriate to an official document. Oliver took it directly to Opal, where she was in the kitchen garden with Mrs. Alvarez, and he held it out to her without a word. She opened it with steady hands and read it. Then she read it again. Then she stood in the kitchen garden in the summer afternoon with the smell of sage and tomato plants around her, and held a document that said, in the formal language of the territory, that the Clearwater parcel, 1,200 acres along the North Creek, was the legal property of Opal Ford, confirmed heir to the filing of Thomas Ford, deceased, original claim dated 1871. She put her face into her hands, just for a moment. Not weeping exactly, but something close to it, a release of everything that had been held tight for so long. Then she lowered her hands and looked at Oliver, who was watching her with those dark, steady eyes and an expression that was not quite smiling but was something tender and warm and completely unguarded. "It's done," he said. "It's yours." "It's mine," she said, and her voice was rough with it. Mrs. Alvarez, who had been following none of the conversation because of the language barrier but had been reading the room with perfect accuracy, nodded with great satisfaction and went back into the house, leaving them standing in the garden. "What happens with Caldwell?" Opal asked when she had herself fully composed. "Mr. Santos is filing the writ formally with the county recorder and the territorial court," Oliver said. "It takes precedence over Caldwell's county-level claim. He has 30 days to remove his cattle from the Clearwater parcel. If he doesn't, we can get a territorial marshal to enforce it." He paused. "He may make noise. He may try to contest it in territorial court. But the original filing is airtight and Baxter's certification is very clear. He won't succeed." "How much noise?" Opal asked. "Some," Oliver acknowledged. "He'll be angry and loud and possibly try to threaten. But he knows, or will know when Santos files, that fighting this legally will expose his county-level fabrications. That's a risk he won't take." He looked at her. "He's going to back down. He's that kind of bully. Loud until there's actual cost to him, then quiet." He was right. Over the following 2 weeks, Caldwell was indeed loud. He sent a letter through the county commissioner disputing the writ. He made statements at the Silver Spur Saloon that were reported back to Oliver in short order, and he rode past the quarter-circle fence line once at a pace that was deliberate enough to be noticed. But when Mr. Santos filed the formal writ with the county recorder and delivered a legal notice to Caldwell's ranch that included the clear statement that any further contest would require a territorial court proceeding that would necessarily involve examination of how his county-level claim had been created, Caldwell went quiet. 42 days after the writ was issued, which was 12 days past the original deadline but within the grace period that Santos had strategically built into the notice, Caldwell's cattle were off the Clearwater parcel. All of them. Oliver rode the boundary with Opal the morning after, and the land was empty of everything but the grass and the creek and the cottonwood trees, and the spring with its ring of old apple trees that reached their arms out in every direction. wild and tangled and completely alive. They stood at the spring in the morning light, their horses drinking from the cold water beside them, and Opal looked at the land that was now legally, officially, undeniably hers, and felt her father in it the way she hadn't expected, not as grief exactly, or not only grief, but as presence. As if something of him had been held in this ground and was released now, free in the same moment the land was free. She became aware that Oliver was watching her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them in that moment that was past the point of being unnamed or unacknowledged. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I keep saying thank you and it keeps being insufficient." "It's sufficient," he said. "It isn't," she said. "You did not have to do any of this. You had no obligation to me." "You had no reason to, Opal," he said, and the way he said her name, simply and with a weight she felt in her chest, stopped her. "I had every reason I've been building since the morning you walked up to me on the main street of Dusty Creek and handed me that deed." He looked at her directly, no hedging, no careful qualification, exactly as direct as he always was with everything. "I did not help you through this to be thanked. I helped you because I wanted to be the man who helped you. Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in my entire life in this territory, and because watching you fight for something that was right has been." He paused, and for the first time she saw him searching for words, this man who was usually so precise. "It has been the privilege of my life so far, and I am hoping it is not the end of it." The spring water moved. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. The horses pulled at the grass at the edge of the bank. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Opal asked. "I am saying that I'm in love with you," Oliver said, "and that I am aware we have known each other for less than 2 months, and that you have just recovered your land and your life after a very long, hard time, and I am not asking you for anything. I am only telling you the truth because I have never seen the advantage in telling anything else." Opal looked at him for a long, full moment. The sunlight was coming across the meadow at the angle that made everything golden, and the creek shone, and the apple trees cast their tangled shadows on the grass, and she felt something so full and warm in her chest that she thought her ribs might not contain it. "I have been in love with you since you drew apple trees in the margin of your ranch ledger," she said, "and looked at me with that expression when I found them." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and when he kissed her, it was as honest and direct as everything else about him, warm and certain, with none of the tentative awkwardness of a first kiss, because they had already been so completely themselves with each other that this felt not like a beginning so much as a natural arrival. She kissed him back with everything she had in her, and the land lay around them in the summer morning, her father's land, her land, and the creek ran cold and clear, and the apple trees stood in their crooked rows around the spring, and it was the most right thing in the world. The months that followed were full and real, and sometimes difficult in the everyday ways that life is difficult, but never in the deep, hollow, grinding way that the years of injustice had been. Opal began working the Clearwater parcel in earnest, and it was enormous work for one person. Oliver, without making a production of it, simply incorporated helping her into his daily routine in the practical way. He incorporated everything else. Riding over with Cal and Domingo Reyes several days a week, working on the fencing and the irrigation channels, rebuilding what Caldwell's cattle years had torn up or worn down. She would not let him pay for materials, and he respected that, so the work went more slowly than it might have, but it went forward steadily, which was its own kind of satisfaction. Mrs. Alvarez began coming out to the Clearwater parcel some afternoons to help Opal assess the condition of the old cabin near the spring, which had been standing empty for years and needed considerable work but had good bones. Oliver came one afternoon and stood looking at the cabin with Opal and said, almost to himself, "This could be made into something good." "I know it could," Opal said. She looked at him. "But I've been thinking that 4 miles is not a very practical distance between two people who spend most of their time together anyway." Oliver looked at her. The sun was going down behind the mountains to the west, painting the sky in shades of coral and amber, and Opal Ford was standing in front of her father's cabin with the expression of a woman who had thought carefully about something and arrived at a clear conclusion. "Are you proposing to me?" he asked. "I am observing a logistical inefficiency," she said, and the smile on her face was the full version, the one that had been opening up more and more over the past weeks, changing her face into something that made him feel like the sun had shifted position. "Opal Ford," he said, "if you are willing to accept me, I would like very much to marry you." "I am willing to accept you," she said, "very much." He reached out and took her hand, and they stood in front of her father's cabin, as the desert sky went through its extraordinary evening display of colors, and they were both completely and unhurriedly happy. They married 6 weeks later, in October of 1882, in the small white church at the end of Dusty Creek's Main Street with the peeling paint, and the strong afternoon light coming through the plain glass windows. It was a modest ceremony in the way of the territory, practical and honest. Mrs. Alvarez sat in the front pew and wept with the quiet containment of someone who had waited for this with more patience than the young people involved. Cal and Domingo Reyes sat beside her in their best shirts, Cal with his hat on his knee working the brim with both hands from sheer emotion. Gerald Prout from the land office came and sat in the back, looking pleased with himself in a way that was entirely unjustified but also entirely endearing. Mr. Santos had come up from Albuquerque on other business and happened to be in town, and he sat in the middle pew with the satisfied expression of a man who felt personally responsible for the happiness in front of him, which he partly was. The minister was a gentle older man named Reverend Pierce, who had been in the territory for 20 years and had married enough couples in difficult circumstances that he had developed a particular warmth for the ones who came in clear-eyed and certain. Opal and Oliver were the clearest-eyed and most certain couple he had married in some time, and his ceremony reflected that, honest and warm without being sentimental. When Oliver slid the plain gold ring onto Opal's finger, his hands were steady and his eyes were on her face, and he looked like a man who understood exactly what he was doing and could not imagine doing anything more worthwhile. They lived between the two properties through that first winter, which was a cold and beautiful winter with snow on the Organ Mountains visible from both the quarter circle and the Clearwater cabin, and they spent it working both properties and building the Clearwater cabin into something livable, and then something genuinely fine. Oliver had a gift for construction that he had never really applied to anything as personal as this, and Opal had an eye for the details that made a house into a home, the placement of windows for morning light, the proportion of rooms to one another, the deep porch that would catch the evening shade in summer. By spring of 1883, the cabin had been transformed into a proper house, larger than the original, with a real kitchen and a good fireplace in the main room, and a bedroom with east-facing windows that caught the first light every morning. The apple trees around the spring had been pruned and tended through the winter by Oliver's careful hands, and in April they produced blossoms for the first time in years, filling the air around the spring with a sweetness that made Opal stand very still in the middle of it and breathe. "Your father would have liked this," Oliver said, coming to stand beside her. "He would have loved you," she said, and she meant it completely. Oliver took her hand and they stood in the apple blossoms and the spring light, and the creek ran beside them, and the land was theirs. The first summer on the Clearwater parcel was one of the best of Opal's life. She ran a small herd of cattle, bought with the combined resources of her careful savings, and Oliver's practical understanding of a good deal when he saw one. 12 head to start, good mixed stock. She and Cal Reyes, who was now splitting his time formally between both properties, fenced the grazing areas properly and managed the water carefully. The spring held through the dry season exactly as her father had promised it always would. Oliver came every day, and some days he came and they worked alongside each other in the easy synchronicity of two people whose natural rhythms were genuinely compatible, and some days he came, and the work was secondary to the pleasure of being in the same place. He always brought books. She was working through his library in a systematic but selective way that he found both flattering and amusing. In October, 1 year almost exactly from their wedding day, Opal told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before he went out to the horses, standing in the kitchen with the light coming through the east window the way she had designed it to come, warm and clear on the table, and the coffee cups and his face when he turned to look at her. His expression went through about 4 distinct things in very quick succession: surprise and then comprehension, and then something so warm and open that she felt it like being held, and then a smile that she had never quite seen from him before, the fully released version, nothing held back. "When?" he asked. "April, I think," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her with the particular tenderness of a man who was experiencing something enormous and was letting himself feel it entirely. "April," he said, against her forehead. "April," she confirmed. They told Mrs. Alvarez at supper that evening, and the woman put her hands over her mouth and then immediately began making practical plans for the expansion of the house, which needed a proper nursery. She said, not this arrangement of putting a cradle in the corner of things. A child needed a proper room from the beginning. Oliver said yes to all of it immediately, and Opal laughed, which was what Mrs. Alvarez had intended. They told Cal and Domingo raised the next morning, and Cal shook Oliver's hand so firmly that Oliver winced slightly, and Domingo made a formal little bow to Opal that she found enormously touching. The winter of 1883 passed with a quietness and a domestic richness that neither of them had quite anticipated. Oliver read to her in the evenings, which was a habit that had started one night when she was too tired from the day's work to hold a book herself, and he had simply picked it up and continued where she had left off, and which had continued long after the tiredness was no longer the reason. They read history and fiction and natural philosophy, arguing over the ideas in comfortable, energetic voices, Mrs. Alvarez occasionally calling from the kitchen that she could hear them from there, and could they please reach an agreement. The nursery was completed in February, a small bright room off the main bedroom with a window facing south for the winter light, and a wooden cradle that Oliver had built himself over several weeks, working in the barn in the evenings, the sound of his sawing, and sanding a quiet constant in the house. He had carved a small apple tree on the headboard of the cradle. He did not mention it, just brought the finished piece in one morning and set it in the nursery without ceremony. Opal stood in the doorway looking at the carved tree for a long time before she said anything. "It's perfect," she finally said. "I thought it fit," he said from behind her, and she heard the particular carefulness in his voice that meant he was moved by something and was managing it with his usual quiet containment. She turned around and walked directly into his arms and held on, and he held her back, and they stood like that in the doorway of the nursery for a while, the winter light coming through the south window onto the carved apple tree in the wooden cradle, and neither of them needed to say anything. Their son was born in late April of 1884, in the bedroom with the east-facing windows, on a morning when the apple trees were in full bloom for the 2nd year running, and the air coming through the open window smelled of blossoms and creek water and warm spring earth. Mrs. Alvarez had taken charge of the birth with the competence of someone who had done this before many times, and the doctor from Dusty Creek, a sensible man named Dr. Reeves, had come out and been entirely adequate in his role. Oliver had spent the labor hours in the main room, sitting in the reading chair with a book open in his lap that he did not read a single word of, and listening to every sound from the bedroom with an intensity that Cal Reyes, who had been sent to the main house to wait and came instead to the Clearwater house and sat with him, found both admirable and slightly alarming. When Mrs. Alvarez came to the door of the main room and said, in her matter-of-fact way, "You have a son." Oliver stood up so quickly that his chair scraped the floor. The boy was healthy and furious about having arrived, making his opinion of the whole situation very clear in the first minutes of his life. Opal was tired and luminous and holding him with the careful wonder of someone handling something precious. And when Oliver sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, his face did the thing it sometimes did when he felt something enormously, going very still and very serious. All the careful control he kept over himself suspended, and he looked at this small, roaring person in his arms as if he was seeing something he had not quite known was possible. "Hello," he said to the baby. In the quiet, direct way he said everything that mattered. The baby kept making his views known. Oliver held him steadily, with the instinctive competence he brought to everything physical, and very gradually the roaring subsided, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newborn, not seeing much but sensing everything. "Thomas," Opal said, and Oliver looked at her. "Thomas," he agreed, without a moment's hesitation. Thomas Oliver Hayes, named for his grandfather first and his father second, was born on a morning in April when the apple trees bloomed, and the Clearwater Spring ran clear and cold beside the house, and the land that had held his grandfather's grief and his mother's determination lay open and whole in the New Mexico sun. As spring turned to summer, the family settled into its new rhythms with the same organic naturalness that had characterized everything between Oliver and Opal from the beginning. Thomas was a serious, watchful baby who regarded the world with dark eyes exactly like his father's, and occasionally produced a smile of such complete and unexpected brilliance that it stopped everyone in the room, which Opal said was also exactly like his father. Oliver did not work any less hard after Thomas was born, but the quality of his attention to the ranch and the land changed in a way that even Cal Reyes commented on. "He looks at the grass different now," Cal said to Domingo one afternoon, watching Oliver ride the fence line. "Like he's thinking about it going on past him." Domingo nodded, understanding perfectly what this meant. They had a good year, 1884, with fair weather and good cattle prices, and the apple trees producing their first real fruit since Opal had claimed the land. Not a large crop, but enough. Small green gold apples with a tart sweetness that Opal made into preserves that Mrs. Alvarez declared the best she had eaten in the territory. Oliver ate 2 jars of it single-handedly over the course of a month, and felt no guilt about this whatsoever. They had a stream of visitors in those months, people from Dusty Creek and beyond, some curious and some genuinely friendly, and the Clearwater house developed a reputation for hospitality in the particular way that houses do when the people in them are genuinely glad to see people, and are good at cooking and conversation. Mr. Santos came up from Albuquerque twice and sat on the porch and talked law and philosophy until late in the evenings. Edmund Baxter from the Santa Fe Land Office came once, a gentle older man who stood at the spring and looked at the apple trees with the expression of someone who had processed a great many land documents in his life and was glad that occasionally they resolved like this one. There was a moment that autumn, a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the light was the particular amber of October, and Thomas was asleep in the cradle in the nursery, and Oliver was reading in the front room, and Opal was working on the accounts at the kitchen table, when she looked up from the ledger and through the doorway at her husband in the reading chair with his book, the afternoon light on his face, completely at ease in the world he had built and the life they were building together. And she felt something so enormous and so specific that she had to set her pen down. She got up and walked to the doorway of the front room and leaned against the frame. Oliver looked up. "I just wanted to see you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and then he set the book down on the side table and reached his hand out toward her. She crossed the room and took it, and he pulled her down to sit on the arm of the chair beside him, and she put her arm around his shoulders and they sat in the October afternoon light, and listened to the creak and the occasional sound of the horses in the paddock and the distant conversation of Cal and Domingo over some ranch work matter, and it was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing in the world. "I want to tell you something," Oliver said. "Tell me," Opal said. "The morning you walked up to me on the street in Dusty Creek," he said, "and you handed me that deed." He paused, looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was thinking precisely. "I knew before I finished reading it that it was real. The document was authentic and the claim was sound and it was completely clear. But the reason I said what I said, the reason I said sit down, this is yours, was not just because of the deed." He looked up at her. "It was because of you. Because of the way you stood there holding it. Like you had carried that thing so carefully for so long, and you were giving me this one moment to tell you that you had been right to carry it." Opal was quiet for a moment. "I had been carrying it for months," she said, "and before me my father carried it for years." "I know," Oliver said, "and I knew that morning, or felt it, something I couldn't quite articulate." He squeezed her hand. "I just wanted you to know that it was not only the deed I was responding to." She leaned her head against his, and they stayed there in the chair in the afternoon light. And outside, the apple trees were dropping their last fruit of the season into the grass around the spring, and the creek ran its endless cold course over polished stones, and the land held them both with the ancient patient continuity of good ground. The following years wrote themselves in the particular language of the territory, in weather and work and the small accumulations of a life. A daughter came in 1886, a fierce and determined creature from her first breath, who they named Alina after Oliver's mother, who had died when he was 12 and whom he spoke of with a quiet, consistent love. Thomas, by then 2 years old, regarded his new sister with the cautious diplomatic suspicion of a small person who is not entirely sure about a major change, and then, over the course of a few weeks, simply absorbed her into his universe and began acting as her personal guardian, which was a role he took with complete seriousness. The Clearwater herd grew to 40 head by 1886, and then 60 by 1888. Opal expanded carefully, exactly as Oliver had always done with his own property, one solid step at a time, never overreaching, always watching the water and the grass. She had a genuine talent for the cattle business that the men who came to deal with her were occasionally surprised by and learned quickly not to underestimate. She kept excellent records, negotiated contracts without sentiment, and had an instinctive grasp of the relationship between land management and long-term profitability that some ranchers with 20 years of experience had not quite achieved. Oliver watched all of this with a pride that was entirely uncomplicated by any sense of competition or diminishment, which was, as Cal Reyes once observed to Domingo with quiet directness, probably the main reason those two were as happy as they were. "He wants her to be exactly herself," Cal said, "not a smaller version." In 1887, they got word from Albuquerque that Harlan Caldwell had sold his ranch and left the territory. The sale had apparently been precipitated by a series of financial difficulties, some related to a questionable business venture in Colorado, and some to a lawsuit brought by a group of smaller ranchers who had finally, emboldened perhaps by Opal's successful claim, taken legal action over water rights Caldwell had been misappropriating. Oliver told Opal the news over breakfast one morning, reading it from a letter from Mr. Santos, and she received it with a quietness that was not satisfaction exactly, or not only satisfaction. "Good," she said after a moment. "Good," Oliver agreed. "I don't wish him specific ill," she said carefully. "But I won't pretend his absence from this territory is anything but better for the people in it." "No pretending required," Oliver said, and folded the letter. They said no more about it. Caldwell had taken up enough of their lives already. The end of the decade brought changes to the territory in the way the end of decades always does, some visible and dramatic, the railroad reaching further and further into what had been open range, and some subtle, the slow accumulation of towns and farms and all the infrastructure of a territory moving toward statehood. Dusty Creek grew, got a proper school and a second doctor and a telegraph office, and the road north from town was improved enough that getting to the quarter circle and the Clearwater parcel was considerably easier than it had been in the early years. Oliver's ranch and Opal's parcel were, by the late 1880s, operating effectively as a single enterprise, not merged legally but coordinated so thoroughly in their daily working that the distinction was mainly a matter of the records in the county land office. They talked about formalizing the arrangement several times, combining the properties into a single holding, but they never quite got around to it, because there was something that both of them felt but rarely articulated about the separateness. The Clearwater parcel was Thomas Ford's land, filed in his name in 1871, and there was a kind of rightness to keeping it its own thing, a tribute to the stubborn, faithful act of keeping a deed for 11 years when everything said the keeping was futile. Thomas, at 6 and then 7, was learning the land with the unconscious absorption of children who grow up in a specific place and are loved there. He could identify the North Creek by the sound of it from 100 yards in the dark. He knew which of the apple trees around the spring produced the sweetest fruit and which produced the best for cooking. He could read the sky for weather with a child's earnest attention that was already becoming something more reliable than guessing. One afternoon in the summer of 1889, Oliver was teaching Thomas to read a survey map at the kitchen table, an activity Thomas was fully engaged by, when Opal came in from the garden and stopped in the doorway watching them. This man who was her husband and this boy who was their son, both bent over the same piece of paper with the same quality of focused attention, the same slight furrow between the brows, the same occasional precise gesture with one finger to indicate a specific point. She felt the full weight of everything that had brought them here, the long years of her father's dispossession and grief, the 300-mile ride with a piece of paper folded against her heart, the moment in Dusty Creek's morning sun when a man in a gray vest had read that paper and looked up and said the thing that changed everything. The years of work and love and the ordinary, extraordinary life of two people who had found each other in the best and most improbable way, in a moment of pure necessity and honest action. She thought about her father planting apple trees, putting them in the ground as an argument against giving up. They were still there. They would be there for Thomas after her and for whoever came after Thomas. Oliver looked up and saw her in the doorway, and the look on his face was simply everything, warm and present and unhurried, the look of a man who is entirely where he intends to be. "Come and see this," he said. "Thomas figured out the section markings before I could explain them." "Because they're logical," Thomas said, without looking up from the map. "You just have to know what the numbers mean." Opal came to the table and sat beside them, and Oliver's hand found hers under the table and held it, and Thomas continued explaining his mastery of survey notation with the earnest confidence of a 7-year-old who is correct and knows it. And outside the window the creek ran and the apple trees stood in their rows and the land lay open in the New Mexico afternoon, entirely itself, entirely theirs. There would be more years after this. More seasons on the Clearwater parcel and the quarter circle, more calves born and cattle sold and letters exchanged with Alina's family in Texas, and with Edmund Baxter, who had retired from the land office but still wrote twice a year. There would be Thomas growing tall and serious and brilliant with land and animals, and Alina growing into a person of such vivid and forthright character that she terrified and delighted everyone around her in equal measure. There would be a second son, James, born in 1890, who had Opal's green eyes and Oliver's stillness, and who would grow up with the particular quality of the youngest child in a happy family, knowing himself loved without question, and therefore free to be curious about everything. There would be more evenings on the porch with the mountain view going amber and rose in the sunset, and more mornings when Oliver brought coffee to where Opal was already up and working, and more quiet moments in the apple orchard that had grown productive and generous under their care, and more suppers at the big table with Mrs. Alvarez presiding and Cal and Domingo bringing their own families as the years went on, because the Clearwater house had the quality of a place where people wanted to gather. There would be the moment in 1893 when Thomas Ford's grave in Las Cruces was moved to the land, a small ceremony of quiet importance, just the family and a few close friends, the minister from Dusty Creek reading words that were simple and honest, and Opal standing at the new grave marker with Oliver's arm around her, and both of them knowing that the man who had carried a deed for 11 years was now resting in the ground he had loved, the spring running nearby, the apple trees overhead. There would be all of this and more, unwritten but fully lived. But the heart of it, the thing that held all the rest, was this. A woman had ridden into a small territory town in 1882 carrying a dead man's deed and a living determination to see justice done for a father who had been wronged. And a man with dark eyes and a gray vest had read the document she put in his hands and had said, with the simple directness that was the truest thing about him, "Sit down, this is yours." And from that moment forward, through every practical step and every hard year and every sweet season, what had grown between them was the most durable and most generous thing either of them had ever known. The land held them and they held each other, and the creek ran on, cold and clear, over the polished stones, and the apple trees bloomed every April, faithfully and without fail, as they had always done, as they would continue to do long after the names of the people who had loved them were only memory, roots going down and branches going up, enduring in the manner of all good things that are planted with the full intention of lasting.